Nobody noticed the woman who mopped the floors at Fort Bradley's main mess hall at 0530 every morning. They certainly didn't know that Sergeant First Class Maria Santos had once held the record for the longest confirmed kill shot in the history of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The same hands that now gripped a mop handle had once steadied a Barrett M82 sniper rifle through a 1,200-meter shot that saved an entire convoy from ambush. The morning routine never changed. Maria arrived before dawn, unlocked the heavy metal doors with keys that jangled against her hip, and began the methodical process of transforming the chaotic aftermath of dinner service into a spotless dining facility. Tables that had hosted rowdy conversations between young soldiers were wiped down with industrial cleaner. Floors that bore the scuff marks of combat boots were mopped until they gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Steam tables that had dispensed thousands of meals were scrubbed until every trace of grease disappeared. She worked in silence, moving with an efficiency that spoke of military precision, though no one bothered to notice the calculated economy of her movements. Every gesture served a purpose. Every step followed the most direct path. Every task was completed with the kind of attention to detail that had once meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But to the soldiers who stumbled in for breakfast at 0600, she was simply the cleaning lady, invisible and unremarkable. Maria's current uniform consisted of navy blue coveralls with Santos embroidered above the left breast pocket. No rank insignia adorned her shoulders. No unit patches proclaimed her achievements. No ribbons told the story of deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and places whose names never appeared in newspapers. The only hint of her military background was the way she stood, perfectly straight with shoulders back, and the precision with which she completed every task. Her workstation occupied a corner of the mess hall kitchen, a small area equipped with industrial cleaning supplies, floor buffers, and the tools of commercial sanitation. A metal locker held her personal belongings, a thermos of coffee that she'd learned to make strong enough to keep her alert during the long, quiet hours before the base came alive, a worn paperback novel that she read during brief breaks, and a small wooden box that she never opened at work but carried with her everywhere. The box contained her medals: Bronze Star with Valor Device, Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge, Army Commendation Medal with V Device, Expert Marksmanship Badge with rifle and pistol bars. Each piece of metal and ribbon represented moments when her skills had mattered, when her presence on a battlefield had changed outcomes and saved lives. Now they sat in darkness, as forgotten as the woman who'd earned them. Fort Bradley was a training installation where young soldiers learned the fundamentals of military service before deploying to operational units around the world. The base hummed with constant activity, drill sergeants shouting commands across parade grounds, the rattle of equipment being cleaned and maintained, the rhythmic sound of boots on pavement as units marched between training areas. It was a place where careers began, where civilians transformed into warriors, where the future of the military took shape one recruit at a time. The mess hall served as the social center of this transformation. 3 times a day, hundreds of soldiers gathered to eat, talk, and decompress from the intensity of their training. Conversations ranged from complaints about demanding instructors to speculation about upcoming deployments. Young recruits shared stories from home while seasoned drill sergeants offered advice about military life. The noise level during peak hours was overwhelming, a cacophony of voices clattering utensils and scraping chairs that echoed off the concrete walls. But Maria experienced the mess hall during its quietest hours, when the vast space felt almost cathedral-like in its emptiness. She preferred the solitude, the chance to work without interruption, the peace that came with completing tasks that had clear beginnings and definite endings. Unlike the complex moral calculations required of a sniper, cleaning was straightforward. Dirt was removed, order was restored, progress was visible and immediate. The other base personnel who interacted with Maria treated her with polite indifference. Kitchen staff nodded when they arrived for their shifts, acknowledging her presence, without curiosity about her background. The mess hall supervisor, Staff Sergeant Mike Robbins, handed her work orders with the casual efficiency of someone who viewed her as a piece of equipment rather than a fellow soldier. Even the security guards who unlocked the building each morning barely registered her existence. This invisibility was partially self-imposed. Maria had learned that people saw what they expected to see, and they expected to see a middle-aged woman in coveralls whose job involved unglamorous but necessary work. She didn't correct their assumptions or volunteer information about her background. The simplicity of being overlooked was in many ways a relief after years of being watched, evaluated, and depended upon in life or death situations. Her daily routine extended beyond the mess hall. After completing the morning cleaning, Maria reported to the base motor pool where she performed maintenance on vehicles that rarely left the installation. Oil changes, tire rotations, basic mechanical work that kept the fleet of trucks and Humvees in working condition. This secondary assignment supplemented her primary job while keeping her occupied during the hours when the mess hall was busy with meal service. The motor pool assignment had been a compromise. When Maria's active duty service ended due to injuries sustained during her final deployment, the Army offered her the opportunity to remain on base in a civilian capacity. The medical retirement process had been lengthy and complicated, involving multiple evaluations of both her physical limitations and psychological fitness for continued service. The final determination was that while she remained capable of military duties, the severity of her injuries made her unsuitable for combat operations. The injuries themselves were invisible to casual observation. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had damaged her left shoulder, limiting her range of motion just enough to affect her ability to maintain the perfect stability required for precision shooting. The same explosion had caused a traumatic brain injury that, while mild sometimes, affected her concentration during high-stress situations. Neither condition prevented her from living a normal life, but both disqualified her from the specialized role that had defined her military career. Rather than accept discharge and transition to civilian life, Maria had chosen to remain connected to the military through her current position. The decision puzzled some of her former colleagues, who couldn't understand why someone with her training and experience would accept such a dramatic reduction in status and responsibility. But Maria understood something they didn't, that sometimes the most valuable service happened in the shadows, performed by people who asked for no recognition and received none. The wooden box in her locker contained more than medals. Tucked beneath the ribbons and badges was a folded letter, written in her own handwriting but never sent. The letter was addressed to the families of soldiers whose lives she'd saved through precision fire during her deployments. She'd started writing it during her final hospitalization, attempting to explain how their sons and daughters had fought with courage and honor, how their sacrifices had mattered, how their memories deserved to be preserved. But the letter remained unfinished and unmailed, because Maria couldn't find words adequate to the weight of what she'd witnessed. How do you tell a mother that her son died instantly, that he felt no pain when you were the one who watched through a scope as life left his eyes? How do you explain to a father that his daughter's final act was covering the retreat of her squad, when you were the one who provided overwatch but couldn't prevent the enemy fire that found its mark? These questions followed Maria through her daily routine, adding weight to tasks that should have been simple and straightforward. Every plate she washed represented a meal shared by soldiers who might soon face the same dangers she'd experienced. Every floor she mopped reflected the faces of young recruits who reminded her of the men and women she'd served alongside in combat zones. Every window she cleaned offered a view of training areas where the next generation of warriors learned skills they might need to survive in places where survival was never guaranteed. The transition from active combat operations to custodial work had been jarring but not entirely unwelcome. After years of operating in environments where every decision carried life or death consequences, there was something therapeutic about work that involved no moral complexity. Dirt was dirt. Clean was clean. No one's life depended on weather. She achieved perfect results, and mistakes could be corrected without catastrophic consequences. But the military precision ingrained by years of specialized training remained evident in everything she did. Her cleaning supplies were organized with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to ammunition and equipment maintenance. Her work schedule followed the rigid timing that had been essential for coordinated operations. Her awareness of her surroundings retained the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in hostile territory. The other veterans on base occasionally recognized something familiar in her bearing. The way she carried herself with quiet confidence and maintained situational awareness even during routine tasks. But none of them connected the competent cleaning woman with the legendary sniper whose exploits had become part of unit folklore. The stories they told about Ghost, the female sniper who could make impossible shots under extreme conditions, described someone larger than life, not the unassuming woman who emptied their trash cans and mopped their floors. This disconnect between reputation and reality suited Maria perfectly. Fame had never been her objective. Recognition had never motivated her actions. The satisfaction of mission accomplishment, the knowledge that her skills had protected other soldiers, the bonds forged with teammates who depended on her precision, these had been the rewards of her previous life. Now in her current role, she found different but equally valid satisfaction in maintaining the environment where others could focus on their own missions without distraction. The wooden box also contained photographs, images that captured moments of camaraderie and purpose from her operational years. Her spotter, Corporal Danny Martinez, grinning beside their hide site after a successful mission. Her team leader, Captain Sarah Mitchell, briefing the squad before a complex operation. The members of her final unit, posed together at their forward operating base just weeks before the explosion that ended her combat career. These faces reminded her that military service encompassed more than individual achievement. It was about being part of something larger, about contributing to missions that mattered. As she finished her morning routine and prepared for the transition to her motor pool duties, Maria reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this point. 10 years ago, she'd been one of the most elite soldiers in the Army, trusted with missions that required absolute precision and unshakable nerve. Today, she was invisible to most of the people around her, valued for her reliability but unknown for her capabilities. Yet there was a kind of peace in this anonymity, a freedom from the constant pressure that had defined her operational years. No one expected her to make split-second decisions that would determine whether missions succeeded or failed. No one depended on her ability to place bullets with surgical precision under extreme stress. No one looked to her for leadership in situations where leadership meant the difference between life and death. The morning sun streamed through the mess hall windows as Maria gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to lock up the facility. In a few hours, the space would fill with young soldiers beginning another day of training, learning skills that might someday save their lives or the lives of their teammates. They would eat their meals, share their stories, and continue their transformation from civilians to warriors, never knowing that the woman who ensured their environment remained clean and functional had once been one of the most feared and respected snipers in military history. But Maria knew. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be essential, to be the person others turned to when the situation seemed impossible, to be the guardian angel watching over her fellow soldiers from positions they never knew existed. Those memories lived in the wooden box alongside her medals, preserved but separate from her current reality, ready to be honored but never displayed. The invisibility was comfortable, but it was also temporary. Because somewhere in the distant future, a situation would arise that required the skills she'd spent years perfecting, the knowledge she'd gained through countless hours of training and operational experience. When that moment came, the quiet woman who cleaned the mess hall would reveal herself to be something far more formidable than anyone imagined. The first whispers started in the motor pool during Maria's second week on the job. Specialist Jake Thompson, a 19-year-old mechanic from Ohio, was explaining to anyone who would listen why the old-school methods were obsolete and inefficient. He gestured dramatically with a wrench as he spoke, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd recently completed technical training and believed he understood everything about military operations. "These older folks just don't get it," Thompson announced while Maria worked quietly on an oil change 3 bays away. "Everything's digital now. GPS, thermal imaging, computer-assisted targeting systems. Why would anyone waste time learning stuff that was outdated 20 years ago?" His audience consisted of other young soldiers who nodded along, eager to demonstrate their allegiance to modern military thinking. Staff Sergeant Mike Robbins, the mess hall supervisor, held similar views but expressed them with the authority of someone who'd spent 8 years in the Army without ever deploying to a combat zone. During his weekly staff meetings, he frequently emphasized the importance of efficiency and modernization. "We're not running a museum here," he would say, looking directly at Maria as if her presence somehow represented resistance to progress. "This is a 21st century military installation, and we need to operate like it." The dismissive attitude extended beyond individual conversations to become part of the institutional culture at Fort Bradley. Training curricula focused exclusively on current technology and contemporary tactics. Historical case studies were limited to recent conflicts, and lessons learned from earlier wars were considered irrelevant to modern operational requirements. The assumption was that technological advancement had made traditional skills obsolete, that satellite communications and precision-guided munitions had eliminated the need for the kind of individual expertise that had once defined elite soldiers. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, embodied this philosophy in her leadership style and decision-making processes. A West Point graduate with an MBA from a prestigious civilian university, she approached military operations with the mindset of a corporate executive optimizing systems for maximum efficiency. Her briefings invariably included charts showing cost savings achieved through technological upgrades and personnel reductions. She spoke frequently about right-sizing the force structure and eliminating redundancies created by outdated practices. During a recent all-hands meeting, Colonel Hayes had addressed the base personnel with characteristic directness. "The future of military operations lies in leveraging technology to multiply force effectiveness," she declared from behind a podium equipped with the latest presentation equipment. Individual heroics and specialized skills belong to an earlier era. Today's military professionals succeed through teamwork, technology integration, and adherence to standardized procedures. Maria had attended that meeting, sitting in the back row among other civilian employees and lower-ranking enlisted personnel. She'd listened to the colonel's words without expression, recognizing the logic behind the modernization emphasis while understanding the limitations of an approach that discounted hard-won experience and specialized knowledge. But she'd said nothing, offered no contrary perspective, raised no questions that might have challenged the prevailing orthodoxy. The physical environment at Fort Bradley reinforced the message that newer was inherently better. Training facilities featured state-of-the-art equipment designed to simulate combat conditions through virtual reality and computer-generated scenarios. Ranges were equipped with electronic scoring systems that provided instant feedback and detailed analytics. Classrooms utilized interactive displays and multimedia presentations that made traditional instruction methods seem primitive by comparison. Even the base housing reflected this emphasis on modernization. New construction followed contemporary designs that prioritized energy efficiency and technological integration. Older buildings, including the mess hall where Maria worked, were scheduled for eventual replacement or extensive renovation. The message was clear: the military was moving forward, embracing innovation, leaving behind the methods and facilities that had served previous generations. The younger soldiers absorbed this message eagerly, viewing themselves as representatives of a more advanced and capable military than their predecessors. They spoke dismissively of old-timers who clung to outdated practices and resisted technological innovation. During break conversations in the mess hall, they shared stories about instructors who seemed hopelessly behind the times, drill sergeants who emphasized skills that modern equipment had rendered unnecessary, and senior NCOs who couldn't adapt to new systems and procedures. Private First Class Ashley Chun, a communications specialist fresh from advanced individual training, exemplified this attitude during a lunch conversation with her peers. "My grandfather was in Vietnam," she said while picking at her salad. "He keeps telling me about all this stuff they had to learn back then, reading maps, using compasses, calculating artillery coordinates by hand. I mean, why would anyone need to know that when we have GPS and digital fire control systems?" Her table mates nodded in agreement, sharing their own examples of generational disconnects with family members who'd served in earlier conflicts. The consensus was that previous generations had faced challenges that no longer existed, had developed skills that modern technology had made irrelevant, had earned reputations based on capabilities that contemporary soldiers possessed through superior equipment rather than individual training. This perspective extended to their view of the civilian employees who supported base operations. Custodial staff, maintenance workers, and administrative personnel were seen as necessary but unremarkable components of the military machine, valued for their reliability but not consulted for their expertise. The possibility that someone cleaning floors or changing oil might possess knowledge relevant to military operations simply didn't occur to soldiers, who'd been taught that expertise flowed downward through official channels and formal training. Programs. Maria observed these attitudes without surprise or resentment. She'd seen similar patterns throughout her military career: the tendency for each new generation to view itself as more advanced than its predecessors, the confidence that came with mastering the latest equipment and procedures. She understood the psychology behind it, the need to believe that current methods represented progress, that training and preparation were building toward something better than what had come before. But she also understood the limitations of this perspective, the dangers of assuming that technological advancement eliminated the need for fundamental skills and hard-won experience. She'd operated in environments where satellites failed, where electronic systems were jammed or destroyed, where survival depended on knowledge that couldn't be downloaded or updated through software patches. She'd learned that the most sophisticated equipment was only as effective as the person using it, and that person's capabilities were determined by training, experience, and the kind of judgment that developed over years of facing unpredictable challenges. The motor pool provided daily examples of the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Young mechanics could diagnose electronic problems using computerized diagnostic equipment, but they struggled with mechanical issues that required understanding how systems actually worked rather than simply following troubleshooting procedures. They could replace components identified by error codes, but they couldn't identify problems that manifested through subtle changes in sound, vibration, or performance. Maria watched this phenomenon play out repeatedly as she worked alongside the younger mechanics. They would spend hours running diagnostic tests on vehicles that she could identify as having simple mechanical problems within minutes of hearing the engine run. But pointing out these shortcuts would have violated the unspoken hierarchy that placed certified expertise above experiential knowledge, formal training above intuitive understanding. the same dynamic existed in other areas of base operations. Information technology specialists could manage complex network systems, but sometimes missed security vulnerabilities that would have been obvious to someone with operational experience in contested environments. Military police officers were well trained in crowd control and facility security, but had limited understanding of the surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques that had been essential for force protection in combat zones, even the bases. Tactical training reflected this emphasis on technology over individual skills. Shooting instruction focused on equipment familiarization and standardized techniques, rather than the kind of advanced marksmanship that had once been considered essential for military effectiveness. Soldiers learned to operate sophisticated weapon systems, but received minimal training in the fundamentals of ballistics, environmental factors, and target engagement under stress. Range officers themselves products of this modernized training approach, supervised exercises that emphasized compliance with safety regulations and adherence to prescribed procedures. They measured success through standardized scoring systems and qualification standards that bore little resemblance to the challenges soldiers might face in actual combat situations. The possibility that someone with extensive operational experience might have insights worth sharing simply wasn't part of their conceptual framework. Maria had occasionally observed training exercises from her position maintaining base vehicles, watching as instructors taught techniques that she knew were outdated or incomplete. She'd seen soldiers struggle with concepts that she could have explained clearly, fail to grasp principles that seemed obvious to someone with her background. But intervention would have required breaking the silence she'd maintained since accepting her current position, revealing capabilities that she preferred to keep private. The dismissive attitude toward historical knowledge extended beyond military skills to encompass broader questions about the value of experience and institutional memory. Base personnel showed little interest in learning from previous conflicts, studying case studies from earlier wars, or understanding how current capabilities had evolved from earlier innovations. The assumption was that rapid technological change had made historical knowledge irrelevant, that lessons learned in previous eras had no application to contemporary challenges. This perspective was reinforced by the rapid pace of military modernization, the constant introduction of new systems and procedures that required extensive training and adaptation. Personnel were so focused on keeping up with current changes that they had little time or inclination to study historical precedents. The emphasis was on moving forward, not looking backward, on mastering the present rather than learning from the past. But Maria knew that military history was filled with examples of situations where traditional skills and hard-won experience had proved decisive, where technological advantages had been neutralized by environmental factors or enemy countermeasures, where individual expertise had made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She'd lived through some of those situations herself, had seen how quickly sophisticated systems could fail and how rapidly modern warfare could revert to fundamental principles that hadn't changed significantly over decades of technological advancement. The irony was that Fort Bradley's mission involved training soldiers who would deploy to environments where these historical lessons remained relevant, where they might face challenges that couldn't be solved through standard procedures or technological solutions. The young recruits who dismissed traditional skills as obsolete would soon find themselves in situations where improvisation, individual expertise, and hard-won experience could mean the difference between life and death. Yet the institutional culture continued to reinforce the message that progress meant abandoning the past, that modernization required rejecting traditional knowledge, that the future belonged to soldiers who embraced technology and dismissed the methods of their predecessors. This message was delivered through official policies, training curricula, and the countless informal interactions that shaped military culture at every level. Maria understood that challenging this perspective would require more than simply sharing her knowledge or demonstrating her capabilities. It would require a situation where the limitations of the modern approach became undeniably clear, where the value of traditional skills could be demonstrated rather than merely asserted. Until that moment arrived, she would continue her quiet routine, maintaining her anonymity while carrying knowledge that others had chosen to forget. The first signs of trouble appeared in the intelligence briefings that Colonel Hayes received every Monday morning at 0800 hours. The reports spoke of increased activity along the Mexican border, about organized groups that seemed to be conducting reconnaissance of military installations throughout the southwestern United States. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to convey concern without creating panic. But the underlying message was clear. Someone was taking a very serious interest in American military capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the base intelligence officer, presented these briefings with the methodical precision of someone who had never served outside the continental United States. His PowerPoint slides displayed satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and pattern analysis that painted a picture of coordinated surveillance efforts targeting multiple installations. The conclusion was always the same: increased vigilance was recommended, but no immediate threat was identified. These appear to be probing actions, Webb explained during one typical briefing, his laser pointer dancing across a map dotted with red markers. Professional reconnaissance, possibly conducted by foreign intelligence services testing our response capabilities. The activities are sophisticated, but not immediately threatening. We're monitoring the situation in coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. Colonel Hayes listened to these presentations with the patience of someone who trusted in systems and procedures to manage complex security challenges. Her background was in logistics and administration, not operational planning, but she had confidence in the institutional safeguards that protected military installations from external threats. The base had multiple layers of security, state-of-the-art detection systems, and protocols developed by experts who understood modern security challenges. But the reports kept coming, week after week, describing activities that seemed to be increasing in frequency and sophistication. Photography of base perimeters from positions that suggested professional surveillance techniques. Attempts to engage base personnel in casual conversations that probed for information about security procedures and operational schedules. Electronic signatures that indicated sophisticated monitoring equipment being operated in the vicinity of the installation. The response was predictably bureaucratic. Security protocols were reviewed and updated. Additional briefings were conducted for personnel with access to sensitive information. Coordination meetings were held with local law enforcement agencies and federal security organizations. But the fundamental assumption remained unchanged, that existing systems and procedures would prove adequate to handle whatever threats might materialize. Maria learned about these developments through the informal communication networks that existed among base support personnel. Kitchen staff heard fragments of conversations from officers who ate in the mess hall. Maintenance workers overheard radio traffic while servicing vehicles used by security personnel. Custodial employees like herself moved through spaces where sensitive discussions took place, becoming inadvertent repositories of information that others assumed was safely compartmentalized. The picture that emerged from these fragments was more concerning than the sanitized briefing suggested. The surveillance activities weren't random or opportunistic. They followed patterns that suggested detailed planning and professional execution. The individuals conducting reconnaissance possessed equipment and capabilities that exceeded what local law enforcement typically encountered. Most troubling, the activities seemed to be building towards something more substantial than simple information gathering. Maria's understanding of these patterns was informed by experience that none of the base's official security personnel possessed. During her operational years, she had conducted similar reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, learning to identify the signs that preceded more aggressive actions. She recognized the methodical approach to target analysis, the systematic gathering of information about defensive capabilities, and the patient development of operational plans based on observed vulnerabilities. The reconnaissance activities around Fort Bradley exhibited all these characteristics, but the base's response suggested that decision-makers didn't fully appreciate what they were facing. The security measures being implemented were appropriate for deterring opportunistic criminals or casual trespassers, but they weren't designed to counter professional intelligence, operations conducted by well-trained and well-equipped adversaries. During her daily routine, Maria began to notice details that others missed or dismissed as unimportant. Vehicle traffic patterns on roads surrounding the base had changed subtly, with certain cars appearing repeatedly at different times and locations. Communication equipment in the motor pool occasionally detected brief electronic signals that didn't match known base systems or civilian radio traffic. Most significantly, she observed that some base personnel were unconsciously modifying their behavior in ways that suggested they felt they were being watched. These observations accumulated over several weeks, creating a mosaic of indicators that painted a picture of escalating threat activity. But Maria's position in the base hierarchy meant that her insights were neither sought nor welcome. The official intelligence apparatus operated through formal channels that didn't include input from custodial workers, regardless of their qualifications or experience. The assumption was that relevant information would be identified and processed by trained professionals using established procedures. The institutional blindness was reinforced by the base's organizational culture, which compartmentalized information according to rank and security clearance, rather than expertise or operational experience. Personnel who might have valuable insights were excluded from decision-making processes because their current positions didn't align with formal authority structures. Knowledge was assumed to flow downward through official channels rather than upward from those who possessed relevant experience. This compartmentalization was particularly problematic because the emerging threat seemed to exploit gaps in traditional security models. The reconnaissance activities were being conducted by individuals who understood how military installations operated, who knew which information was valuable and how to obtain it without triggering standard detection systems. They were professionals facing amateurs, experienced operators challenging a system designed to handle conventional threats. The breakthrough in the surveillance pattern came during a Tuesday morning when Maria was performing routine maintenance on vehicles parked near the base perimeter. A sedan had been positioned on a hill overlooking the motor pool for approximately 30 minutes, its occupants using what appeared to be professional photography equipment to document vehicle movements and personnel activities. The positioning was expert, taking advantage of natural concealment while maintaining clear sightlines to target areas. But Maria noticed something that the base's official security systems had missed. The same vehicle had appeared in the same location exactly 1 week earlier at precisely the same time of day. The repetition suggested that the surveillance was following a systematic schedule, probably designed to establish baseline patterns of activity that could be exploited during a more aggressive operation. Professional reconnaissance teams used this technique to identify predictable vulnerabilities in target security measures. The implications were sobering. If hostile surveillance teams were conducting detailed pattern analysis of base operations, they were likely preparing for some form of direct action. The patient, methodical approach suggested capabilities and intentions that went far beyond casual intelligence gathering. Someone was investing significant resources in understanding Fort Bradley's vulnerabilities, and that investment was unlikely to be purely academic. Maria found herself in an impossible position. Her operational experience told her that the situation was developing in a dangerous direction, that the base was facing a level of threat that its current security measures weren't designed to counter. But her current role gave her no official avenue for communicating these concerns, no way to contribute her analysis to the base's threat assessment process without revealing capabilities that she preferred to keep private. The problem was compounded by the fact that her insights were based on pattern recognition and operational intuition rather than concrete evidence that could be presented through formal intelligence channels. She couldn't document her concerns using the standardized formats that military bureaucracy required for serious consideration. Her warnings would be dismissed as speculation from someone whose current position didn't qualify her to make strategic assessments. Meanwhile, the base's official response to the escalating surveillance activities remained focused on procedural adjustments and administrative measures. Additional briefings were conducted, security protocols were reviewed, and coordination with external agencies was enhanced. But the fundamental assumption remained unchanged, that existing systems would prove adequate to handle whatever challenges might arise. The disconnect between official confidence and operational reality became increasingly apparent as the surveillance activities continued to intensify. Photography sessions became more frequent and systematic. Electronic monitoring equipment appeared at multiple locations around the base perimeter. Most concerning, there were indications that the surveillance teams were beginning to focus on specific operational areas rather than conducting general reconnaissance. Maria's concerns deepened when she observed that the surveillance activities were targeting the base's most vulnerable operational periods. Early morning hours when security staffing was reduced. Shift changes when personnel were transitioning between duties. Training exercises when attention was focused on internal activities rather than external threats. The timing wasn't coincidental. It reflected detailed knowledge of base operations and careful planning for future actions. The pattern analysis also revealed that the surveillance teams possessed sophisticated counter-detection capabilities. They varied their methods and locations to avoid establishing predictable patterns that might trigger security responses. They used equipment and techniques that suggested professional training and significant resources. Most troubling, they demonstrated awareness of the base's security measures and seemed to be specifically testing response procedures. Colonel Hayes continued to receive intelligence briefings that described the situation in measured, bureaucratic language that downplayed the potential for immediate threats. The reports acknowledged increased surveillance activities, but emphasized that appropriate countermeasures were being implemented through proper channels. The overall assessment remained that existing security protocols were adequate to protect the installation from hostile activities, but Maria's operational experience suggested a different interpretation of the intelligence patterns. The surveillance activities weren't just information gathering. They were preparation for operations that would require detailed knowledge of base vulnerabilities and security procedures. The methodical approach, professional execution, and systematic pattern development all indicated that someone was preparing for aggressive action against Fort Bradley. The irony was that the base housed some of the military's most advanced training facilities and sophisticated security systems, but it was being threatened by adversaries who understood that the most effective attacks often exploited assumptions rather than technology. The security measures were designed to counter known threats using established procedures, but they weren't prepared for professional operators who understood how those measures worked and how they could be circumvented. As the surveillance activities continued to escalate, Maria found herself observing the developing situation with the analytical skills that had made her one of the military's most effective snipers. She tracked patterns, identified vulnerabilities, and developed threat assessments based on operational experience that couldn't be replicated through training or technology. But her insights remained private, her warnings unspoken, her expertise unrecognized by those who most needed to hear it. The storm clouds were gathering around Fort Bradley, but the base's leadership remained focused on procedural responses and administrative solutions. They were preparing to fight the last war rather than the current threat, trusting in systems that had been designed for different challenges and different adversaries. The quiet woman who mopped their floors understood what they faced, but she remained invisible to those who made the decisions that would determine whether the base was prepared for what was coming. The crisis was building toward a moment when theoretical knowledge would prove inadequate, when standard procedures would fail, when individual expertise and hard-won experience would become the difference between success and catastrophe. That moment was approaching faster than anyone in authority realized, and when it arrived, the fate of Fort Bradley might depend on capabilities that had been dismissed as obsolete and knowledge that had been forgotten by everyone except the woman they never noticed. The attack began at 0437 hours on a Tuesday morning when most of Fort Bradley was still wrapped in darkness. Maria was completing her routine inspection of the mess hall, checking that all surfaces had been properly sanitized and equipment secured for the night, when the first explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence. The blast came from the direction of the main gate, a deep, thunderous sound that rattled windows and sent emergency lighting flickering throughout the building. Her military training kicked in instantly, overriding years of civilian routine. Maria dropped to a crouch behind the serving counter, her body automatically seeking cover while her mind processed the acoustic signature of the explosion. High explosives, probably plastique, designed to breach reinforced barriers rather than cause maximum casualties. This wasn't a terrorist attack aimed at creating fear. It was a military-style assault designed to penetrate base defenses and achieve specific tactical objectives. The base alarm system activated 30 seconds later, its piercing wail echoing across the installation as emergency lights bathed everything in red. Through the mess hall windows, Maria could see muzzle flashes erupting from multiple positions along the perimeter fence. The attackers had coordinated their assault to begin simultaneously from several directions, overwhelming the base's ability to respond effectively to any single breach point. Radio chatter exploded across the emergency frequencies as security personnel attempted to assess the situation and coordinate their response. Maria could hear fragments of desperate communications through her maintenance radio. Multiple breaches at gates 2 and 4. Unknown number of hostiles, request immediate backup. Heavy weapons fire from the north fence line. The voices carried the tension of soldiers facing a situation they hadn't been trained to handle. Colonel Hayes's voice cut through the radio chaos, attempting to establish command and control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. All units. This is base command. Implement emergency protocols, Bravo 7. Security teams to defensive positions. All non-essential personnel to designated safe areas immediately. Her words carried authority, but Maria could detect the underlying uncertainty of someone who had never commanded during actual combat operations. The attackers had clearly studied the base's emergency procedures, because their assault was specifically designed to exploit the predictable response patterns. As security teams rushed toward the breached gates, secondary explosions erupted at unexpected locations, indicating that the attackers had pre-positioned charges throughout the perimeter. The base's defenders were being channeled into kill zones that had been carefully prepared in advance. Maria moved carefully toward the windows facing the main gate, staying low to avoid presenting a silhouette against the emergency lighting. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the sophistication of the attack. The assault team moved with professional military precision, using coordinated fire and movement techniques that indicated extensive training and combat experience. These weren't amateur terrorists or local criminals. They were professional soldiers conducting a complex operation against a target they had studied thoroughly. The attacking force appeared to consist of approximately 20 individuals organized into 4-man teams, each equipped with automatic weapons, body armor, and night vision equipment. They advanced using cover and concealment techniques that demonstrated familiarity with military tactics and base layout. Most concerning, they seemed to know exactly where the base's defensive positions were located and how to avoid or neutralize them systematically. Staff Sergeant Robbins burst into the mess hall, his face flushed with exertion and panic. "Santos, what are you still doing here? All civilian personnel are supposed to be in the gymnasium." His voice cracked with stress as another explosion echoed from somewhere near the administrative buildings. He was carrying his sidearm but had clearly never drawn it in a combat situation. His hands were shaking as he tried to maintain control of both the weapon and the situation. "I was securing the facility when the attack began," Maria replied, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos erupting around them. "What's the current tactical situation?" The question came naturally, a product of years spent in command. Positions where understanding the bigger picture was essential for making sound decisions. But Robbins looked at her with confusion, as if the idea of asking a custodian for tactical assessment was incomprehensible. "Just get to the gymnasium." "Like everyone else," he snapped, clearly overwhelmed by responsibilities he wasn't prepared to handle. "The security teams have everything under control." His words were contradicted by the continuing sounds of explosions and automatic weapons fire, but he seemed to need to believe that standard procedures would somehow resolve a situation that had moved far beyond the scope of normal base security operations. Through the radio chatter, Maria could hear that the base's communication systems were being systematically jammed or destroyed. The attackers were using electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt coordination between defensive units, preventing effective command and control over the base's response. This level of sophistication suggested state-sponsored operations rather than criminal or terrorist activities. The main computer networks had also been compromised, probably through cyber attacks that had been coordinated with the physical assault. The base's modern security systems, which relied heavily on electronic surveillance and automated response protocols, were failing one by one as the attackers exploited vulnerabilities that had been identified during their reconnaissance operations. "Lieutenant." Colonel Webb's voice crackled over the radio. "Reporting from the Base Operations Center, Command. We're showing multiple system failures across all electronic surveillance networks. Unknown if this is equipment malfunction or hostile interference. Recommend immediate transition to manual backup procedures." His bureaucratic training was evident in his careful language, but Maria could hear the panic underneath his professional demeanor. Colonel Hayes responded with increasing frustration. "Webb, I need actionable intelligence, not status reports. How many attackers? What are their objectives? Where are they headed?" But the intelligence officer couldn't provide answers because the base's information gathering systems had been designed around technological solutions that the attackers had specifically targeted for neutralization. The sound of automatic weapons fire was getting closer, moving from the perimeter toward the interior of the base. Maria realized that the attackers had successfully breached the outer defenses and were advancing toward what they probably considered high-value targets: the administrative buildings, communication facilities, and training areas where they could cause maximum disruption to base operations. Robbins was still standing in the mess hall doorway, paralyzed by indecision and overwhelmed by a situation that bore no resemblance to the security scenarios he had trained for. The base's emergency procedures assumed that threats would be contained at the perimeter or resolved through coordination with external law enforcement agencies. No one had planned for the possibility of professional military forces conducting sustained operations inside the installation. "Sergeant," Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "The gymnasium is a tactical disaster. It's a large, centralized location with limited exits and no defensive positions. If the attackers know the base layout, It's exactly where they'd expect to find concentrated personnel. Her analysis was based on operational experience that Robbins lacked, but he was too stressed to appreciate the source of her insights. "Those are the orders," he replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. "All civilian personnel to the gymnasium for protection and accountability." He was clinging to procedures that had been developed for different types of emergencies, unable to adapt to circumstances that required tactical thinking rather than administrative compliance. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications from the base's defensive teams. "Gate 4 security, we need immediate reinforcement. Hostiles have breached the inner perimeter. Motor pool under heavy fire, requesting permission to fall back to secondary positions. Medical facilities. REPORTING wounded personnel need immediate evacuation support." The situation was deteriorating rapidly as the attackers continued their systematic advance. Maria could hear the distinct sound signatures of different weapon systems being employed by both sides in the conflict. The base security personnel were using standard issue M4 carbines and M9 pistols, weapons that were adequate for normal law enforcement situations, but outclassed by the automatic weapons and specialized equipment being used by the attackers. The engagement was fundamentally unequal, pitting lightly armed security guards against professional soldiers equipped for sustained combat operations. The attackers' advance was following a pattern that Maria recognized from her operational experience. They were systematically neutralizing the base's ability to coordinate an effective defense by targeting communication nodes, command facilities, and key personnel. This wasn't a random assault designed to cause casualties. It was a carefully planned operation aimed at paralyzing the installation's ability to function. Through the mess hall windows, she could see muzzle flashes moving through the vehicle maintenance area, where she had worked just hours earlier. The attackers were using the motor pool's layout to provide cover while they advanced toward the administrative complex, demonstrating detailed knowledge of base geography that could only have been obtained through extensive reconnaissance. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The electronic jamming was becoming more sophisticated, interfering not only with radio communications, but also with the base's internal telephone systems and computer networks. The attackers had clearly invested significant resources in electronic warfare capabilities, suggesting backing from organizations with access to military-grade equipment and technical expertise. Colonel Hayes's attempts to coordinate the defense were becoming increasingly frantic as her command and control systems failed one by one. All units switched to backup communication frequencies. Implement emergency protocols for complete electronic failure. But the backup systems had also been compromised, leaving the base's defenders operating as isolated units without central coordination or tactical intelligence. The base's young security personnel, trained primarily for routine law enforcement duties, were encountering combat stress for the first time in their military careers. Their radio communications revealed increasing panic as they faced professional adversaries, using tactics and equipment that exceeded their training and experience. Many had never fired their weapons outside of qualification ranges, and none had experience with sustained combat operations. Maria watched through the windows as one of the base security teams attempted to establish a defensive position near the communications building. Their movements were textbook perfect for training exercises, but inappropriate for actual combat, making them easy targets for attackers who understood how to exploit predictable responses. Within minutes, the position was overrun and the defenders were forced to retreat in disorder. The attackers' night vision equipment gave them a significant advantage over defenders who were operating primarily with standard flashlights and emergency lighting. The base's floodlight systems had been among the first targets destroyed, leaving most of the installation in darkness that favored the better-equipped assault force. Staff Sergeant Robbins was becoming increasingly agitated as he realized that the situation was spinning beyond his ability to control or understand. His training had prepared him to manage routine security issues and coordinate with civilian law enforcement, but nothing in his background had equipped him to handle a military-style assault by professional soldiers. "This isn't supposed to happen," he muttered, more to himself than to Maria. The security protocol should have prevented this. The detection system should have provided early warning. The response team should have contained the threat at the perimeter. He was experiencing the collapse of institutional assumptions that had formed the foundation of his professional understanding. The sound of explosions was now coming from multiple directions simultaneously, indicating that the attackers had established positions throughout the base and were conducting coordinated operations against multiple targets. The assault had moved far beyond a simple breach of perimeter security. It had become a comprehensive military operation designed to neutralize Fort Bradley's ability to function as a training installation. Radio communications from the Base Operations Center revealed that Colonel Hayes was attempting to contact external military and law enforcement agencies for assistance, but the electronic jamming was interfering with long-range communications equipment. The base was effectively isolated, cut off from outside support during the critical early phases of the assault when immediate response might have made a difference. The systematic nature of the attack suggested that the assault force intended to hold their positions for an extended period rather than conducting a quick strike operation. They were equipped and positioned for sustained operations, which meant that the base's defenders would need to maintain resistance until external forces could organize an effective response. Maria understood that the conventional response to this situation would fail because it was based on assumptions about threats and capabilities that didn't match the current reality. The base's defenders were implementing procedures designed for different circumstances, using equipment inadequate for the challenges they faced, and relying on training that hadn't prepared them for professional military opposition. The moment had arrived when theoretical knowledge would prove insufficient, when standard procedures would fail, when survival would depend on experience and expertise that couldn't be taught in classrooms or acquired through technology. The quiet woman who cleaned the floors understood what needed to be done, but she remained invisible to those who desperately needed her knowledge and capabilities. The sound of automatic weapons fire grew closer to the mess hall, punctuated by the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds striking concrete and metal. Maria could distinguish between the sharp reports of M4 carbines used by base security and the deeper, more sustained bursts from the attackers' automatic weapons. The engagement ratios told a story that Staff Sergeant Robbins couldn't interpret, but that Maria understood with crystalline clarity. The defenders were being systematically overwhelmed. Through her maintenance radio, she heard Specialist Thompson's voice from the motor pool, high-pitched with panic. "They've got us pinned down behind the Humvees. These guys know exactly where our positions are. It's like they've got our defensive plans." His words confirmed what Maria had suspected during the reconnaissance phase. The attackers possessed detailed intelligence about Fort Bradley's security protocols and defensive arrangements. A massive explosion erupted from the direction of the communications building, sending a fireball into the pre-dawn sky that illuminated the entire base in orange light. The blast was followed by the distinctive whine of electrical systems shorting out as the installation's primary communication hub was destroyed. Colonel Hayes's voice disappeared from the radio frequencies, replaced by static and the desperate calls of isolated units trying to establish contact with anyone who might coordinate their defense. Maria made her decision in that moment of electronic silence. Years of suppressed instincts and carefully controlled expertise could no longer be contained within the constraints of her custodial role. The base was facing annihilation, and the defenders lacked both the experience and the tactical understanding necessary to prevent catastrophe. Someone with her capabilities had to act. regardless of the personal consequences. "Sergeant Robbins," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that cut through his panic like a blade. "Give me your radio and your sidearm. The current defensive strategy is failing, and people are going to die if someone doesn't take charge of this situation." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The quiet cleaning woman had vanished, replaced by the professional soldier, who had once been among the military's most deadly and effective operators. Robbins stared at her with incomprehension, his mind struggling to process the sudden change in her demeanor and the confidence with which she issued commands that contradicted everything he understood about military hierarchy. "What are you talking about? Your civilian support staff. You can't just—" His protest was cut short by another explosion, this one close enough to rattle the mess hall windows and shower the floor with fragments of broken glass. "Listen to me very carefully," Maria continued, moving toward him with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to operating under extreme stress. "I'm Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, former 75th Ranger Regiment, sniper specialist with 3 combat deployments. I've been working maintenance and custodial duties since my medical retirement, but I retain clearance and operational authority under emergency combat conditions." The words hit Robbins like physical blows, each revelation contradicting his assumptions about the woman he'd supervised for months without truly seeing. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a desperate hope as he began to understand that someone with actual combat experience might be able to make sense of the chaos that was destroying his orderly military world. "But you're just you clean floors," he stammered, still struggling to reconcile his perception of Maria with the professional soldier who now stood before him. "Nobody said anything about you being. I mean, your personnel file doesn't show any combat experience." His bureaucratic mind was grappling with the possibility that official records might not contain all relevant information about the people working under his supervision. "My service record is classified at levels above your clearance," Maria replied, extending her hand for his sidearm with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Right now, that's irrelevant. What matters is that I can read this tactical situation, and you can't. Give me the radio and the weapon, and I'll try to save as many lives as possible." Robbins hesitated for another moment, torn between ingrained respect for official procedures and the increasingly obvious reality that those procedures were inadequate for current circumstances. The sound of sustained gunfire from multiple directions finally decided him. With shaking hands, he transferred his M9 pistol and portable radio to Maria, symbolically acknowledging her authority, even though he didn't fully understand the basis for it. Maria checked the pistol's condition with practiced efficiency, confirming that it was loaded and ready while simultaneously adjusting the radio to scan emergency frequencies. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each action flowing seamlessly into the next, with the fluidity that came from thousands of hours of training and operational experience. The radio revealed the full scope of the disaster unfolding across Fort Bradley. Security teams were scattered and disorganized, many cut off from central command and operating without tactical intelligence or coordination. Medical personnel were trapped in facilities that were under direct attack. Administrative staff were cowering in buildings that offered concealment, but no protection against the military-grade weapons being used by the assault force. "Base Security Team Alpha, this is Santos," Maria transmitted, using her former rank and unit designation to establish credibility with personnel who didn't know her current status. "Report your position and tactical situation immediately." Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command responsibilities during crisis situations. The response came from Corporal Jennifer Martinez, a young security specialist whose voice trembled with stress and confusion. "Santos? I don't recognize that call sign. Who is this? We're pinned down in Building 7, taking heavy fire from at least 2 positions. Our team leader is wounded, and we can't reach base command for instructions. This is a former Ranger Regiment. Assuming tactical command of defensive operations, Maria replied, her words delivered with the crisp precision that left no room for argument. Acknowledge if you understand and are prepared to follow instructions that may keep you alive. The radio frequencies fell silent for a moment as scattered defenders processed this unexpected development. Lieutenant, Sarah Kim's voice crackled. Through the static, calling from somewhere near the training facilities, whoever you are, our standard procedures aren't working. These attackers know our positions, our capabilities, everything. If you've got experience with this kind of situation, we need help now. Her admission represented the collapse of confidence in official protocols and a desperate willingness to accept guidance from any source that might offer survival. Maria began coordinating the defense with the systematic approach that had made her an effective leader during her operational years. She gathered intelligence about enemy positions, friendly unit locations, and available resources while simultaneously developing a tactical plan that could salvage something from the disaster that Fort Bradley had become. All defensive units, listen carefully, she transmitted. The attackers are using night vision and electronic warfare capabilities. They've studied our procedures and are exploiting predictable response patterns. From this point forward, we abandon standard protocols and implement combat survival tactics. Her instructions were specific and actionable, based on hard-won experience in environments where survival depended on adapting quickly to changing circumstances. She directed teams to abandon exposed positions and establish overlapping fields of fire from concealed locations. She identified rally points where scattered personnel could consolidate into effective fighting units. Most importantly, she began coordinating a defense that used the base's terrain and infrastructure to neutralize the attackers' technological advantages. The transformation in radio communications was immediate and dramatic. Instead of panicked voices calling for instructions that never came, the frequencies filled with professional military coordination as defenders began implementing tactics that actually addressed their tactical situation. Maria's experience and authority provided the missing element that had prevented effective resistance. Building 7 team, you're going to move in stages to the vehicle maintenance area, she directed. Use the drainage ditches for concealment and avoid silhouetting yourselves against the emergency lighting. Once you're in position, you'll have clear fields of fire toward the attackers advancing from the north gate. Staff Sergeant Robbins watched this coordination with amazement, finally understanding that he had been working alongside someone whose capabilities far exceeded anything suggested by her current position. The quiet efficiency with which she managed multiple tactical situations simultaneously demonstrated a level of professional competence that he'd never encountered during his conventional military career. But Maria's most crucial decision was yet to come. Through her analysis of the attackers' movement patterns and objectives, she had identified their primary target, the base armory, where they could obtain additional weapons and ammunition while denying those resources to the defenders. The assault force was advancing systematically toward that facility, and once they controlled it, the base's resistance would become impossible to sustain. The armory was located in a reinforced building at the center of the installation, protected by multiple security systems that had already failed under the attackers' electronic warfare assault. Standard defensive procedures called for security teams to establish a perimeter around the facility, but Maria knew that those positions would become death traps for defenders facing professional soldiers with superior equipment and training. Instead, she began developing a plan that would use her specialized skills to address the threat in a way that conventional tactics could not. The attackers expected to face predictable resistance from security personnel operating according to standard procedures. They weren't prepared for the possibility that Fort Bradley's defenders included someone with the training and experience to engage them using their own methods. All units, I'm going to neutralize the primary threat, Maria announced over the radio. "Continue defensive operations according to the instructions I've provided, but do not approach the armory area. I'll be operating alone in that sector." Her words carried the finality of someone who understood the risks involved, but had made a calculated decision based on tactical necessity. Robbins grabbed her arm as she prepared to leave the mess hall. "You can't go out there alone. Those are professional soldiers with military equipment. Send one of the security teams. It's their job to handle this kind of situation." His concern was genuine, but it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what the situation required. "The security teams are brave and well-trained, but they're not equipped for this kind of engagement," Maria replied, gently removing his hand from her arm. "I am. This is exactly the kind of problem I was trained to solve, and I'm the only person on this base with the necessary capabilities." Her words were matter-of-fact, delivered without bravado or false heroics. She moved toward the mess hall's rear exit, checking her equipment one final time while mentally reviewing the route that would take her to an optimal position for engaging the assault force threatening the armory. Years of specialized training and operational experience had prepared her for exactly this moment, when individual expertise and professional skill would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed. Quiet woman who had been invisible to everyone around her was about to become the most important person on Fort Bradley. The skills that had been dismissed as obsolete, the knowledge that had been forgotten by institutional memory, were about to prove their value in the most decisive way possible. Maria Santos was going back to war, and this time she would be fighting to protect the home front rather than engage enemies in distant lands. The base's fate now rested with someone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten by everyone who should have recognized her capabilities. The cleaning woman was about to remind Fort Bradley why some skills never become obsolete, why experience matters more than technology, and why the quiet professionals who serve without recognition are often the ones who make the difference when everything else fails. Maria slipped through the mess hall's rear exit into the pre-dawn darkness, her body automatically adopting the low-profile movement patterns that had kept her alive in hostile territory across 3 combat deployments. The familiar weight of the M9 pistol felt almost insignificant compared to the precision rifle she'd once carried, but her mind was already calculating distances, angles, and sight lines with the methodical precision that had made her legendary. Among her former unit, the base's emergency lighting created harsh pools of illumination separated by deep shadows, a tactical environment that favored someone with her training over the attackers, who relied primarily on technological advantages. Maria moved through these shadows like a ghost, using terrain features and structural elements to mask her approach toward the armory complex, where the assault force was concentrating their main effort. Her route took her past the motor pool where she'd spent countless hours maintaining vehicles that now served as cover for both defenders and attackers. The irony wasn't lost on her, the intimate knowledge of base geography that she'd acquired through months of menial work was now providing crucial tactical advantages that couldn't be replicated through reconnaissance or intelligence gathering. Through her radio earpiece, she could hear the defensive coordination continuing as scattered security teams implemented the tactics she'd provided. Corporal Martinez's voice reported successful repositioning to a concealed overwatch position. Lieutenant Kim acknowledged establishing interlocking fields of fire with another team. The difference in their communications was remarkable. Panic and confusion had been replaced by professional competence as they adapted to combat realities. But Maria's attention was focused on the 8-man assault team advancing toward the armory through a series of coordinated bounds that demonstrated professional military training. They moved with textbook precision, using cover and concealment while maintaining communication discipline and mutual support. These weren't mercenaries or criminals. They were soldiers conducting a mission with strategic implications that extended far beyond Fort Bradley. The team leader was identifiable by his position and the way others oriented on his movements. Maria studied his approach pattern through the scope of experience, noting that he favored positions that provided multiple exit routes and maintained visual contact with his subordinates. He was competent and experienced, but he was also following predictable tactical patterns that someone with her background could exploit. The armory building itself presented both opportunities and challenges for her intervention. The structure was designed to resist conventional assault, with reinforced walls and limited access points that channeled attackers into predictable approaches. But those same features that made it defensible also limited her options for engagement, requiring her to position herself where she could interdict the assault without being trapped by the building's defensive architecture. Maria identified her optimal position, a maintenance shed approximately 200 meters from the armory that provided elevation, concealment, and multiple escape routes while offering clear sight lines to the approaches the assault team would be forced to use. The distance was well within her capabilities, even with the limited equipment available, but it would require precise timing and perfect execution. Moving toward the position required crossing an open area illuminated by emergency lighting, an exposure that would be visible to anyone with night vision equipment. Maria timed her movement to coincide with an explosion from another part of the base, using the distraction and the momentary visual disruption to sprint across the danger area with the fluid speed that had been honed through years of operational training. The maintenance shed's interior provided exactly the tactical environment she needed: elevated position with clear sight lines through windows that could be opened without creating obvious muzzle signatures. The building's construction would muffle the sound of her pistol, while the external noise from ongoing combat would mask any acoustic signature that might reveal her position to the assault team. Through the window, Maria could observe the assault team's final approach to the armory. They had divided into two four-man elements, with one team providing overwatch while the other advanced to breach the facility's main entrance. The coordination was professional, but it followed standard small unit tactics that made their movements predictable to someone with her level of training and experience. The team leader positioned himself where he could observe both elements while maintaining radio contact with other assault teams operating elsewhere on the base. His location made him the critical node in their command structure. Removing him would disrupt their coordination and force the remaining attackers to operate as independent units without centralized control. Maria chambered around in the M9 and settled into a supported firing position that maximized stability while minimizing her profile. The pistol's iron sights were adequate for the engagement range, though she found herself unconsciously compensating for the weapon's limitations compared to the precision instruments she'd once used. Muscle memory from thousands of hours of training took control, adjusting her breathing and trigger control for optimal accuracy. The shot would need to be perfect. A pistol engagement at 200 meters pushed the envelope of what was tactically feasible, even for someone with her marksmanship credentials. Environmental factors including wind speed, atmospheric pressure, and target movement would all influence bullet trajectory. But more importantly, she would only get one opportunity before the assault team identified her position and responded with overwhelming firepower. The assault team leader raised his hand to signal the final phase of their approach, presenting Maria with the target opportunity she'd been waiting for. He was positioned in profile, his body armor oriented to provide protection against threats from the armory rather than from her elevated position. The shot angle would allow her to engage him in the gap between his tactical vest and helmet, a target zone that required absolute precision but would guarantee immediate incapacitation. Maria's breathing slowed to the rhythmic pattern that had become automatic during her sniper training. Her trigger finger applied steady pressure, while her mind calculated the ballistic solution with intuitive precision developed through years of making similar shots under combat conditions. The external chaos of battle faded to background noise. As her concentration narrowed to the fundamental elements of marksmanship, sight alignment, breathing control, trigger squeeze. The M9 bucked in her hands with a sharp crack that was immediately absorbed by the ongoing sounds of combat throughout the base. 200 meters away, the assault team leader collapsed instantly, his body language communicating immediate and complete incapacitation to his subordinates. The precision of the shot and its unexpected origin sent the remaining attackers scrambling for cover while they attempted to identify the source of the threat. The psychological impact of the engagement was as important as its tactical effect. Professional soldiers understood the implications of precision fire from an unknown position. They were facing an opponent with capabilities that matched or exceeded their own training and equipment. The assault team's confidence in their superiority was shattered by a single shot that demonstrated they were no longer operating against conventional security personnel. Radio communications between the assault teams erupted in confusion as they attempted to understand what had happened and how to respond to this new threat. Their electronic warfare capabilities were useless against an opponent who wasn't relying on technological systems for coordination or targeting. The careful planning that had brought them to the edge of success was suddenly compromised by a variable they hadn't anticipated or prepared for. Maria was already moving to her secondary position before the assault team could organize a response to her initial engagement. The maintenance shed had served its purpose, but remaining there would allow the attackers to fix her location and respond with superior firepower. Her next position would provide different angles and sight lines while maintaining the psychological pressure that came from unknown threats operating from unexpected directions. The assault team's response revealed both their training and their limitations. They implemented textbook counter-sniper procedures, but those procedures were designed to address threats from conventional sniper positions using standard equipment and tactics. They weren't prepared for an opponent who understood their methods well enough to anticipate and counter them systematically. Through her radio, Maria could hear the broader impact of her intervention. The assault teams throughout the base were communicating with increasing urgency as they realized that their carefully planned operation was encountering resistance they hadn't expected. The loss of the team leader at the armory had disrupted their timeline and forced them to recalculate their tactical approach. More importantly, the base's defenders were beginning to understand that the situation was changing in their favor. Corporal Martinez reported that the attackers threatening her position had become more cautious and defensive. Lieutenant Kim observed that the assault team near the administrative buildings appeared to be consolidating rather than advancing. The psychological momentum that had favored the attackers was shifting toward the defenders, but Maria understood that her intervention was only buying time for a more comprehensive response. The assault force still possessed significant advantages in equipment, training, and numerical superiority. Her ability to influence the engagement was limited by the weapons and ammunition available to her, and the attackers would eventually adapt their tactics to counter the threat she represented. Her second position provided oversight of both the armory and the communication facility, allowing her to observe how the remaining assault teams were reorganizing in response to the loss of their leader. The professional discipline of their response confirmed her assessment that these were experienced soldiers rather than criminals or terrorists, but it also revealed tactical patterns that she could exploit with additional precision engagements. Assault team at the armory had called for reinforcement from other elements, reducing the pressure on defenders elsewhere on the base while concentrating their remaining strength for a final push toward their primary objective. This consolidation created both opportunities and risks. Maria would face a larger number of opponents, but they would be concentrated in an area where her knowledge of terrain and sight lines provided maximum advantage. Colonel Hayes's voice suddenly crackled through the radio frequencies, transmitted from what sounded like a backup communication facility. All defending units. Federal response forces are en route, but won't arrive for at least 30 minutes. Hold your positions and prevent enemy access to sensitive materials at all costs." Her words carried new authority and confidence, suggesting that the successful defensive actions had restored her belief in the base's ability to resist the assault. Maria checked her ammunition status and confirmed her next engagement. Priorities. The M9 carried 15 rounds, and she'd expended one during the initial shot. Each subsequent engagement would need to achieve maximum tactical effect while conserving ammunition for the extended fighting that would be required until external reinforcements arrived. The attackers were adapting their approach, using smoke grenades to obscure sight lines while advancing in smaller groups that were harder to target effectively. But they were also revealing their remaining strength and capabilities, allowing Maria to develop a comprehensive picture of the opposition she faced and the resources available for defeating it. Through the chaos of combat, a strange sense of clarity settled over Maria as she prepared for the next phase of the engagement. Years of training and experience were crystallizing into the kind of perfect tactical situation that she'd been designed to handle. The quiet woman who'd been invisible to everyone around her was about to demonstrate why some capabilities could never be replaced by technology or standard procedures. The assault on Fort Bradley was about to discover that they'd made a critical error in their intelligence preparation. They'd planned for conventional resistance from security personnel operating according to predictable procedures. They hadn't planned for the possibility that their opposition might include someone with the training and experience to turn their own methods against them. The battle for the armory was about to begin in earnest, and the outcome would determine whether Fort Bradley survived the night intact or fell to an assault force that had underestimated the capabilities of the quiet professional who'd been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. The reinforcement team approaching the armory moved with the cautious precision of soldiers who had learned to respect an unseen threat. Maria counted 12 individuals advancing in a staggered formation that demonstrated their growing understanding that they faced opposition with capabilities matching their own professional training. The cocky confidence that had characterized their initial assault had been replaced by the methodical wariness of experienced operators who knew they were being hunted. From her elevated position in the communications tower maintenance platform, Maria could observe the entire tactical situation developing below. The assault team had established a command post in the vehicle maintenance bay, using the heavy equipment as cover while they coordinated their response to her intervention. Their radio discipline had improved significantly since losing their team leader, but she could still intercept fragments of communication that revealed their tactical intentions. Operational timeline. The base's defensive situation had stabilized remarkably since she'd begun coordinating resistance efforts. Security teams that had been scattered and demoralized were now operating as effective fighting units, using the tactical guidance she'd provided to establish interlocking fields of fire and mutual support positions. The transformation demonstrated how quickly professional soldiers could adapt when provided with competent leadership and realistic tactical direction. Lieutenant Kim's voice crackled through Maria's earpiece with a situation report that confirmed the changing dynamics. Santos, we've established overwatch positions covering all approaches to the administrative complex. The attackers have pulled back and appear to be consolidating near the motor pool. They're moving more carefully now, using better concealment and coordination. Corporal Martinez added her own assessment from the perimeter positions. Whatever you did at the armory got their attention. The team that was pressing our position has withdrawn to support the main assault. We've got breathing room for the first time since this started, and morale is improving significantly among the defensive teams. The psychological impact of her intervention was proving as valuable as the tactical effects. The attackers' aura of invincibility had been shattered by the demonstration that they faced competent opposition, while the defenders' confidence was growing as they realized that effective resistance was possible. This shift in momentum was often decisive in small unit engagements where individual actions could influence the entire battle's outcome. But Maria understood that the most challenging phase of the engagement was yet to come. The assault force was adapting their tactics in response to her presence, implementing counter-sniper procedures that would make future engagements more difficult and dangerous. They were also bringing additional resources to bear on the armory objective, concentrating their remaining strength for a final push that could still achieve their mission despite the setbacks they'd encountered. Through her scope, she could observe the assault team leader's replacement, establishing command and control over the consolidated force. The new leader appeared older and more experienced than his predecessor, someone who understood that the mission's success now depended on neutralizing the threat she represented, while simultaneously accomplishing their original objectives. His body language suggested confidence and determination rather than the caution that had characterized his subordinates' recent movements. The attackers were employing sophisticated counter-sniper techniques, using mirrors and periscopes to observe potential hide sites while maintaining concealment behind armored vehicle hulks in the motor pool. They had correctly identified several positions that could threaten their approach routes and were systematically clearing each location with precision fire before advancing. Their professionalism was evident in every movement and communication. Maria realized that her current position would soon be compromised by this methodical clearing operation. The communications tower provided excellent observation and fields of fire, but it was also an obvious location for a precision shooter to establish overwatch. The assault team would eventually direct focused attention toward her position, and the tower's limited escape routes would make it a potential death trap. Her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Colonel Hayes, broadcasting from the backup command facility. All units, be advised that federal response forces have been delayed due to coordinated attacks on multiple installations throughout the region. The estimated arrival time is now 45 minutes. Continue defensive operations and prevent enemy access to classified materials at all costs. The revelation that Fort Bradley was part of a larger coordinated operation added new dimensions to the tactical situation. The assault wasn't an isolated incident targeting a single installation. It was a component of a strategic operation aimed at multiple military facilities simultaneously. This explained the professional quality of the opposition and the sophisticated planning that had gone into their assault. Maria began moving toward her next position, while the assault team was still occupied with clearing operations in other sectors. Her route took her through the base's utility tunnels, maintenance passages that she'd learned about during her custodial duties, but that weren't included in standard base security plans. These hidden pathways provided movement options that the attackers couldn't anticipate or counter. The tunnel system connected most of the base's major buildings through a network of steam pipes, electrical conduits, and communication cables that required regular maintenance access. Maria had spent hours in these passages during her routine work, learning their layout and understanding how they could be used for movement that avoided surface detection. This knowledge was now proving invaluable for maintaining tactical mobility against a numerically superior opponent. Emerging from the tunnel system near the base's water treatment facility, Maria established her next firing position in a location that provided completely different sight lines to the armory complex. The attackers had focused their clearing operations on conventional sniper positions, but they hadn't considered the possibility that their opposition might use unconventional routes and positions that reflected intimate knowledge of base infrastructure. From her new vantage point, she could observe the assault team's final preparations for their renewed attack on the armory. They had brought additional equipment forward, including what appeared to be specialized breaching charges and electronic warfare devices, designed to neutralize the facility's remaining security systems. The sophistication of their equipment confirmed that this was a state-sponsored operation with access to military-grade technology. The assault team's approach would bring them through a choke point where the base's road network funneled all vehicle traffic past a series of concrete barriers designed to control access to sensitive facilities. These barriers had been intended to stop truck bombs and unauthorized vehicles, but they also created a tactical constraint that limited the attackers' movement options and forced them into predictable routes. Maria calculated the engagement parameters with the methodical precision that had characterized her professional career. The range was approximately 150 meters, well within the effective capability of her M9 pistol when fired from a supported position. Environmental factors including wind speed and atmospheric conditions were minimal, providing optimal conditions for precision shooting. Most importantly, the target zone would allow her to engage multiple opponents as they moved through the constrained terrain. The assault team leader was directing the final coordination from a position that demonstrated both tactical competence and operational caution. He remained in covered positions while maintaining visual and radio contact with his subordinates, positioning himself where he could observe the engagement, while retaining the ability to direct supporting fires if his advance elements encountered resistance. Maria's targeting priority was clear. The team leader represented the command and control capability that enabled coordinated assault operations. Removing him would force the remaining attackers to operate as independent units without centralized direction, significantly reducing their effectiveness against the base's defensive positions. The shot would be technically challenging, but well within her documented capabilities. The engagement commenced as the assault team began their final approach toward the armory, moving with the coordinated precision that marked them as professional soldiers conducting a mission they considered essential to their strategic objectives. Maria tracked the team leader through her sight picture, calculating the ballistic solution while accounting for his movement speed and the slight angle of her firing position. Her second shot struck the target with the same precision as her first, achieving immediate incapacitation and sending the assault team into defensive positions as they attempted to identify the source of the threat. But this time, Maria was already moving before they could organize a response, using her knowledge of the base's hidden passages to relocate before counterfire could be directed toward her position. The psychological impact was devastating to the assault force's morale and coordination. Losing two team leaders to precision fire from an unknown opponent shattered their confidence in their mission success and forced them to acknowledge that they faced opposition with capabilities they hadn't anticipated. Radio communications revealed increasing confusion and disagreement about how to proceed with objectives that seemed increasingly unattainable. The base's defenders responded to this development with renewed aggression and confidence. Security teams that had been pinned down by superior firepower began advancing against attackers who were now focused on defensive survival rather than offensive operations. The tactical momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the defenders, who were now exploiting the psychological advantage that came from successful resistance against apparently superior opponents. Colonel Hayes's voice cut through the radio. Traffic with new authority and determination. All units, the enemy is showing signs of disorganization and withdrawal. Press your advantages while maintaining security of critical facilities. Continue to deny access to sensitive materials and prepare for possible evacuation attempts by hostile forces. Maria established her next position in the base's power generation facility, a location that provided observation of multiple escape routes while offering protection behind heavy industrial equipment. The attackers would soon realize that their mission had failed and would transition from offensive operations to extraction, procedures designed to minimize their losses while preserving operational security. Through her observation post, she could see the assault teams beginning to consolidate their remaining personnel for what appeared to be a coordinated withdrawal from the base. Their movements were still professional and disciplined, but they lacked the aggressive confidence that had characterized their initial assault. They were now operating in damage control mode, attempting to preserve their force while achieving whatever secondary objectives remained feasible. The transformation in radio communications throughout the base reflected the changed tactical situation. Panicked voices calling for help had been replaced by confident coordination between defensive units that were now pursuing a demoralized and disorganized opponent. The security teams were implementing the tactical principles Maria had taught them, using their knowledge of base terrain to maintain pressure on attackers who no longer possessed the initiative. But Maria understood that the most dangerous phase of the engagement was still ahead. Cornered professional soldiers with superior equipment remained extremely dangerous, especially if they decided that destroying base facilities was preferable to allowing their mission to end in complete failure. Her next decisions would determine whether Fort Bradley emerged from the assault intact or suffered catastrophic damage during the attackers' withdrawal. The quiet woman who had been invisible to everyone around her had successfully coordinated the defense of a major military installation, using skills that others had dismissed as obsolete. Her knowledge of traditional tactics and fundamental military principles had proved superior to the attackers' reliance on technology and standard procedures. The forgotten expertise of a custodial worker had saved Fort Bradley from what could have been a devastating defeat, but the battle wasn't over yet. The assault force still possessed significant capabilities and might choose to inflict maximum damage during their retreat rather than accept complete mission failure. Maria's final challenge would be ensuring that their withdrawal didn't result in casualties among the defenders who had fought so courageously under her guidance. The invisible pilot had become visible at last. But her greatest test was still to come. The sound of approaching helicopters reached Maria's ears at 0627 hours, their distinctive rotor signatures cutting through the pre-dawn air as Federal response forces finally arrived at Fort Bradley. Through her position in the power generation facility, she could see the assault teams reacting to this development with the disciplined urgency of professionals who understood that their window for extraction was rapidly closing. Colonel Hayes's voice filled the radio frequencies with new confidence as she coordinated with the incoming support. Falcon Base, this is Fort Bradley Command. We have contained the hostile force to the central complex area. Our defensive teams have maintained security of all critical facilities. Request immediate perimeter establishment to prevent enemy escape and evacuation. The transformation in the base's atmosphere was palpable. Security personnel who had spent hours fighting for survival were now advancing with aggressive confidence, knowing that overwhelming reinforcement was arriving to support their efforts. The psychological shift from desperate defense to victorious pursuit energized every defender as they realized they had successfully protected their installation against professional military assault. Maria watched through her observation post as the assault teams executed their extraction procedures with the same professional competence they had demonstrated throughout the engagement. They moved in coordinated bounds toward predetermined rally points, maintaining defensive security while consolidating their remaining personnel and equipment. Even in defeat, their discipline and training were evident in every movement. The Federal response helicopters established landing zones outside the base perimeter, while ground forces moved to surround Fort Bradley and prevent escape by hostile personnel. Maria could hear radio coordination between multiple agencies as they implemented containment procedures designed to capture or neutralize the assault force while preserving evidence of the coordinated attacks against military installations. Lieutenant Kim's voice crackled through Maria's earpiece with excitement and exhaustion. Santos, we can see the Federal teams deploying around the perimeter. The attackers are trapped between us and the incoming forces. I don't think any of them are getting out of this one. Your coordination saved this base and probably a lot of lives. The praise made Maria uncomfortable in ways that battlefield recognition never had during her operational years. She had acted out of necessity rather than heroism, using skills that had been developed for exactly these circumstances. The transformation from invisible custodian to tactical commander felt natural and appropriate, but the attention that would inevitably follow made her deeply uneasy. Staff Sergeant Robbins appeared at the power facility entrance, moving with the cautious respect of someone who had witnessed capabilities that shattered all his previous assumptions. Santos, Sergeant Santos, Colonel Hayes wants to debrief you immediately. The federal teams need to understand how you coordinated the defense and what intelligence you gathered about the assault force. Maria nodded, understanding that her period of anonymity was permanently ended. The skills she had demonstrated couldn't be hidden or forgotten, and the success of Fort Bradley's defense would inevitably lead to questions about how a custodial worker had possessed the capabilities to coordinate complex military operations. Her service record would be reviewed, her background investigated, and her future role reconsidered by authorities who now understood her true value. The debriefing room had been hastily established in the backup command facility, a cramped space filled with communication equipment and maps showing the tactical situation across multiple military installations. Colonel Hayes sat behind a field desk alongside federal agents and military intelligence officers who had arrived with the response force. Their expressions showed a mixture of professional curiosity and barely contained amazement. "Sergeant Santos," Colonel Hayes began, her voice carrying new respect and authority, "I've been reviewing the initial reports from our defensive teams. It appears that your intervention was decisive in preventing the loss of this installation. I need you to walk us through your actions and provide your assessment of the assault force capabilities and intentions." Maria's briefing was methodical and comprehensive, delivered with the precision that had characterized her operational reports during her active duty years. She described the reconnaissance patterns she had observed, the tactical capabilities demonstrated by the assault force, and the coordination failures that had initially compromised the base's defensive response. Her analysis was professional and objective, focusing on tactical lessons rather than personal heroics. The assault teams were professional military personnel with extensive training and sophisticated equipment, she concluded. This wasn't a terrorist attack or criminal operation. It was a coordinated military action against multiple installations, suggesting state-sponsored operations with strategic objectives beyond simple destruction or casualties. The federal intelligence officer leaned forward with intense interest. "How were you able to identify these patterns when our official intelligence apparatus missed them? Your current position doesn't provide access to classified threat assessments or strategic intelligence products. I observed the surveillance activities during my routine duties and recognized the patterns from my operational experience," Maria replied. The reconnaissance techniques were professional grade, conducted by individuals who understood military security procedures and base operations. The timing and coordination suggested extensive planning and detailed intelligence preparation. Colonel Hayes studied the notes she had been taking throughout the briefing. "Your personnel file shows medical retirement from active duty due to combat injuries, but your security clearance and operational authorities appear to remain active. Why weren't we informed that someone with your background and capabilities was assigned to support duties on this installation?" The question touched on administrative complexities that Maria had preferred to avoid discussing. Her transition from active duty to civilian support had involved medical evaluations, security reviews, and bureaucratic processes that had taken months to complete. The final determination had been that she remained suitable for military duties, but was disqualified from combat operations due to her injuries. "My assignment here was considered temporary while my medical status was under review," she explained. "The support duties provided employment and maintained my connection to military service while administrative processes were completed. I didn't." Volunteer information about my background because it wasn't relevant to my assigned responsibilities. The federal agent consulted his tablet computer. According to our records, you were one of the most highly decorated snipers in recent military history. Your operational achievements include some of the longest confirmed kills and most successful missions in the 75th Ranger Regiment's combat history. Why would someone with your capabilities accept custodial and maintenance duties? Maria considered her response carefully. The truth was that she had needed time to process the psychological impact of her combat experiences and adjust to physical limitations that had ended her specialized career. The quiet routine of maintenance work had provided therapeutic value that she couldn't have found in high-pressure military assignments. But explaining these personal factors to official investigators felt like exposing vulnerabilities that she preferred to keep private. I wanted to continue serving in whatever capacity was available, she said finally. The duties provided meaningful work and maintained my connection to the military community. I found satisfaction in supporting the mission, even if my role was different from my previous assignments. Colonel Hayes closed her notebook and looked directly at Maria with an expression that mixed respect with calculation. Sergeant, your actions tonight prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of a major training installation. Your coordination saved lives and protected critical military assets. But your presence here also raises questions about how we identify and utilize personnel with specialized capabilities. The implications were clear. Maria's anonymity was permanently ended, and her future would involve responsibilities that matched her demonstrated capabilities rather than her medical limitations. The quiet custodian who had been invisible to everyone around her would now become one of the most visible and valuable personnel on the installation. Over the following hours, as federal teams processed the captured assault personnel and gathered evidence about the coordinated attacks, Maria found herself at the center of attention that made her profoundly uncomfortable. Security personnel who had previously ignored her now sought her out for tactical discussions. Officers who had never acknowledged her presence now requested her input on defensive improvements and training modifications. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The woman who had chosen invisibility as a refuge from the pressures of her operational career was now more visible than ever before. Her expertise was recognized, her capabilities valued, and her future redefined by circumstances that had forced her to reveal knowledge she had preferred to keep private. But as she walked through Fort Bradley in the morning light, observing the damage from the night's fighting and the grateful faces of personnel who understood that they owed their lives to her intervention, Maria felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since her medical retirement. The skills that had defined her military career remained valuable and necessary, even if they were now applied in different circumstances. The quiet woman who cleaned the mess hall had become the instructor everyone remembered, the leader who had saved Fort Bradley through knowledge that others had forgotten. Her invisible service had ended, but her impact on military training and defensive operations was just beginning. The old skills lived on, passed from one generation to the next, preserved by someone who understood their value even when everyone else had moved on to newer methods. Maria Santos had reminded the military that sometimes the most important capabilities belong to the people no one noticed, and that expertise could never truly become obsolete as long as someone remembered its value and was willing to use it. When circumstances demanded nothing less than perfection. 6 months later, Maria stood before a packed auditorium at the National Defense University, no longer invisible but uncomfortable with the spotlight that now followed her everywhere. The PowerPoint behind her displayed the official statistics. Fort Bradley attack repelled with 0 friendly casualties. Coordinated assault on 7 installations foiled. International terrorist network dismantled, but the numbers didn't capture what really mattered. The lesson isn't about one person's actions, she told the audience of military leaders and defense officials. It's about recognizing value in unexpected places and preserving knowledge that others dismiss as obsolete. In the front row sat Staff Sergeant Robbins, now enrolled in an advanced tactical leadership course. Behind him, Lieutenant Kim nodded approvingly. She'd been promoted and assigned to develop new defensive training protocols based on Maria's methods. Every day, skilled people work quietly around you, Maria continued. Janitors who are veterans, mechanics who are former special forces, kitchen staff who served in places whose names you can't pronounce. We see them, but we don't truly see them. Colonel Hayes, now a general, smiled from her VIP seat. The base she'd once commanded had become a model for integrated defense strategies, with Maria serving as its chief tactical advisor. Don't wait for a crisis to discover the capabilities of the people you work with, Maria concluded. Because when that crisis comes, and it will come, you'll need every bit of knowledge, every forgotten skill, every quiet professional who's been watching and waiting for the moment when their expertise matters most. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. If this story of hidden strength and forgotten heroes inspired you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and become part of our community that celebrates the quiet professionals who change the world without seeking recognition. Share this video with someone who deserves to be truly seen. Because every organization, every team, every community has their own Maria Santos waiting to be discovered. What's your story of hidden potential? Drop it in the comments below.